What if the dinosaurs survived the KPG event is probably one of the most commonly asked Spec Evo questions. It's usually followed by the very pedantic, but unfortunately still necessary reply. Actually, the dinosaurs did survive. Birds are dinosaurs. And that response is correct. Birds are dinosaurs, and there are thousands more species of birds than there are mammals alive today. However, that doesn't really answer the implied question. But it does bring up another question. Why didn't the birds re-evolve into giant dinosaurs? Various paleognaths, forest rockids, bathornithids, and giant enceromorphs have all grown to be very large terrestrial animals. The largest paleognath potentially reached between 700 and 1,000 kilos, and the largest terror bird might have been 400. These are large animals by our modern metrics, but they're dwarfed by the largest herbivores and predators of the Cenozoic and Mesozoic. So why didn't they get bigger? Why weren't there 2 to 3 ton terror birds hunting the 6-ton Helicotherium in the rainforest of Colombia? Why were there no ratites the size of Therizinosaurus or Gigantoraptor? The answer is that the giant birds of the Cenozoic likely represent the near maximum size limit of Euornithian birds because of how their plow-shaped pygostyle affects the way they balance their pelvis and femur joints when they walk. The way their balance is centered applies significantly greater amounts of pressure on their femurs than would have been applied to similarly sized bipedal non-Neo-Avian dinosaurs, making it likely that the elephant bird is roughly the largest a Euornithian can ever get. This does not mean that a bird cannot evolve into a multi-ton megatheropod at some point in the future, but it does mean that in order to do this, they would need to be pressured to evolve a better counterbalance, like the longer pygostyle of the oviraptorids or enantiornithians. This is an action that's easier said than done. This is in part because of Dollo's principle of irreversibility, in which it's argued that, and I quote, an organism never returns exactly to a former state, even if it finds itself placed in conditions of existence identical to those which it previously lived. It always keeps some traces of the intermediate stages through which it has passed. Essentially, the Euornithians are unlikely to be able to simply change their pygostyle into a longer rod shape or reverse it completely and turn it into a long tail without direct genetic tampering, like what's being proposed by Jack Horner's Chickensaurus project. However, if you want to see a project that does explore how Euornithians might evolve into megatheropods, the artist Pagilla on DeviantArt has an incredible series of works detailing how his Megistoornithids evolved a higher number of caudal vertebrae and a modified pelvis, allowing them to break the size limits of our Euornithians after an extinction event in the 29th century. Instead of trying to evolve Euornithians into multi-ton Cenozoic theropods, my project follows the survival of a handful of para-avian and ornithischian dinosaurs in a refugium in eastern Antarctica, not limited by the pygostyle, as they go through the same adaptive radiation that led rodent-sized mammals at the start of the Danian to give rise to bear-sized predators like Ankegalon just 3 million years later. "12 years have passed since the world ended. For the first 2 years after the impact, the dust-induced photosynthetic shutdown devastated the planet's plant life. And for a further decade, that same fine silicate dust shot up into the upper atmosphere, reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth's surface by 10 to 20%. Most of the megafaunal dinosaurs that weren't killed outright by the impact or the firestorms that spread across the planet in the first few days died within months of the catastrophe, and the stragglers were unable to survive the decade-long impact winter that followed. Outside of a few crocodilians and turtles, no animals larger than 25 kilos survived. The age of dinosaurs had come to a close. But what if it hadn't? Along the shores of a small lake, in the Tasmanian Gateway, a strange bird shrieks and squawks near the remains of a long-dead Antarctic megaraptoran. An endling, hatched mere months after the impact, the apex predator of Antarctica grew up in a sick and dying world. The last of its siblings to survive, the predator finally succumbed to starvation along the shores of the lake. The little bird near it is just a year old, but the lives of its parents and grandparents were just as brutal as that of the megaraptoran. Their genus, once spread across most of Gondwana, is now reduced to a few pockets in eastern Antarctica and southern Australia. This little male is lacking, eager to let any female in the area know that he is fit and has secured a nice burrow not far from the shoreline for her to roost in during the winter. As he struts, waiting for a reply, he can hear the occasional cries of competing males. They are few and far between. Surviving the catastrophe may still mean the death of his dynasty should he and his competitors fail to secure companionship. But our little male does not falter. Even as the day drags on into mid-afternoon, he calls out to the fern forest, eagerly awaiting a reply. And then he sees her. She is tired, having flown some distance from her usual watering hole, but as she approaches, she slows, waiting to be impressed by the little male. He is small, even for his age, owing to the lean times of his youth, and though they may be among the last viable mating pairs of their species in the entire world, she still waits for him to impress her with his mating display. In another world, she may have left, unimpressed by his dance and calls, and never found a viable mate. Or perhaps finding another mate, but without as good a nesting location as our little male, dooming their species. But here, in this world, the little male's dance has done its job. The female coos back to him, letting him know that she approves. A dozen similar stories play out in the Australian Gateway, not just with our little male species, but with a few other hardy survivors. And with their success, the doom that came to the non-avian dinosaurs that seemed so total has been forestalled. There will be difficult times ahead as calcium chlorate vaporized by the impact plunges the planet into another episode of climate chaos. But life finds a way. Let's introduce our first survivor, though you already met him on the shores of our Antarctic lake, the speculative genus Antarctolestes. Weighing in at a mere 0.45 kilos and just 60 centimeters long, Antarctolestes Terminus is an Antarctic relative of Rahan avis and Oviraptor. Like its relative in Madagascar, it was capable of powered flight, though again, like its relative, it was an awkward flyer with bat-like flight strokes. However, unlike Rahan avis, and much more like the duck-esque Huscaraptor, Antarctolestes was a semi-aquatic near-shore animal. It fed on plants, fish, and crustaceans like many modern diving ducks, in addition to having more generalist foraging habits. This strategy was employed by the non-migratory dinosaur to survive the months of darkness during the Antarctic winter. Though nowhere near as cold as modern Antarctica, the lean times of the deep winter required this animal to maintain this generalist lifestyle for survival. Like the Euornithian survivors of the KPG impact, Antarctolestes did not have the arboreal niche bias of the Enantiornithian birds that would not survive the extinction event. Instead of roosting in trees, Antarctolestes built its nest in abandoned mammal burrows. Again, a strategy to deal with the harsh Antarctic winters. With many members of Antarctolestes having been fattened up in preparation for winter and held up inside underground burrows at the time of the meteor impact, they were prepared to deal with the firestorms that overtook the world in the immediate aftermath of the strike. And while it did not have the beak that some accredit to helping the Euornithians survive, its adaptations as a small, generalist shoreside omnivore helped preserve the species. The little theropods' teeth serrations were farther apart than those of strict carnivores, making them similar in appearance to those of the troodontid Byronosaurus. These wider serrations allowed the small animal to process plant matter and the seed-bearing cones of Antarctica's decimated trees in the years with no sun, supplementing their diet of small fish and crustaceans that lived in Antarctica's freshwater ecosystems. Like the Euornithian survivors of the KPG impact, Antarctolestes did not have the arboreal niche bias of the Enantiornithian birds that did not survive the extinction event. Instead of roosting in trees, Antarctolestes built its nests in abandoned mammal burrows, again a strategy for dealing with the harsh Antarctic winters. With many members of Antarctolestes having been fattened up in preparation for winter and held up in their underground burrows at the time of the meteor impact in the Yucatan, they were prepared to deal with the firestorms that overtook the world in the aftermath of the strike. Antarctolestes is the lone survivor of the non-avian theropods. From our little male and female will arise a whole set of clades that will conquer the southern hemisphere. But next week, we'll look at a slightly more diverse group of survivors, the small ornithischians that weathered the great tragedy of the KPG.